Test, test, test. Is it picking me up? Okay.
Four more times.
Test, 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 test.
Yeah. One more.
Test, 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 test.
Okay.
Good. I can also move it closer if you want.
Yeah. There's also a sensitivity adjustment, but I think it's fine.
I think it's okay.
It's great. One more.
Test, 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 test. Test, 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 test. Thanks. Thank you. Hopefully sound is working okay. Thanks, I'm really excited to be here. I'm not an astronomer now, but I did as a kid go to plenty of public astronomy nights where I saw celestial objects for the first time that really inspired me to maintain an interest in space. So I think what this organization does is a really cool thing for kids especially. So thank you for doing that, and thanks for having me. Yeah, as was mentioned before, I'm going to talk to you this evening about the particular challenges of sending crews of humans on long-duration exploration missions, especially to the Moon and Mars. And I'll start by just giving a quick introduction. I could just buzz through this stuff, but just wanted to show that I'm part of a lab that supports many PhD, master's, undergraduate students, and postdocs that do research in the area of human spaceflight, and have had the privilege to work with some folks at NASA who focus on these things and have facilities aimed at doing research for supporting long-duration missions, which I'll talk about more later in the talk. But first, probably most of you have not heard the term bioastronautics before. It's a very niche research area. So I wanted to just step through the things that we think about in our research world, because it's pretty different than the astronomy, astrophysics side of things. So starting with the human, the bio side of the name, first we focus on the body and what happens to the body when humans go into space. So these are things like spatial disorientation, so the ability to orient yourself is really reliant on the presence of gravity. When you take humans out of the gravity environment, next level, we also look at the spacecraft and how we can design spacecraft to better support humans in space. So the kind of fundamental provision of air and water and food through the environmental control and life support systems. We also think about human-computer interaction, human-robot interaction, because we know these autonomous systems are really necessary for successful exploration of other worlds, especially when you have a limited crew size. We think about architecture as a way to provide psychological support for astronauts, physical support, and then look at the particular problem space of extravehicular activity, or EVA, which is those spacewalks that are physically and mentally some of the most taxing pieces of space exploration missions for humans. Then one layer out from that, we think about the environment in general, so things like the radiation environment that people are experiencing, which is one of the biggest limiting factors for long-duration missions. Space is also an isolated, confined, extreme environment, which has really specific mental health and behavioral health impacts. And then we also look at teaming and social dynamics, and how do you select who those 4 people should be to go to Mars for 2 years? And how are you going to be able to predict their performance for that entire mission and make sure that they're successful? Should you pick people that already know each other really well, or maybe not? Maybe that would be detrimental. So thinking about team composition and how teams work together. And then overall mission design, thinking about the cadence of launch and reentry and what challenges that might put on the crew as well. So this is sort of the map of what we think about with bioastronautics. In general, it's the study and support of life in space and other complex environments, as was mentioned in the intro. But we really have a diverse range of topics that we research, everything from how to design effective habitats to support human crews, all the way to the specifics of behavioral health, and we work with psychiatrists and psychologists on those problems as well. And really, we're constantly expanding our research methodologies to meet the needs of the challenges that we study. Human spaceflight is a rapidly changing area. We always have new entrants into the human spaceflight community, especially now where we have commercial crews, we have famous pop stars now traveling into space, and the challenges change, right? And the types of people that we're sending to space change. And so the way that we develop our research methods have to change from working with test pilots who are trained to be really high performers and put up with almost anything to maybe much less robust crews. Our research methods are also pretty diverse to meet those broad needs. We do a lot of studies with human participants. So in our labs, we have people come in and participate in experiments. We use qualitative research methods a lot, so surveys, interview methods that we can use to characterize real-world problems. So actually asking people about their interactions with robotic systems, or interviewing about their mental state during a highly stressful task. We also do a lot of physiological signal processing, so a lot of my work is focused on using things like heart rate and sweat rate to detect changes in cognitive load or changes in ambient stress or chronic stress. And this kind of feeds into this idea of psychophysiology, which is really this connection between the body's nervous system and your mental state. So we use that a lot to understand changes in human state by monitoring unobtrusively instead of having to ask people, how are you feeling after each task they perform? A lot of data leads to, of course, a lot of statistical analysis. So that's something that we do quite a lot of, building both explanatory and causal models based on experimental data. I teach a graduate experimental design and statistics course that I'm teaching right now, because you're really combining different types of data that don't always play well together. So physiological signals are continuous quantitative signals. Behavioral data sometimes is not. Survey data, those don't always mix in your analysis. So it takes kind of fine-tuned statistical methods to do that analysis. And then we also do hardware design and prototyping, and I'll come back to this later in the talk, but using wearable sensor systems that are integrated into garments is really important for monitoring things like heart rate in the operational environment, where you need something that's comfortable and usable under a spacesuit or under body armor or whatever it is that you're using in that operational environment. So we do a lot of hardware development and testing and prototyping in our labs as well. So before I talk about the challenges of upcoming exploration missions, I think it's important we talk through the history of human spaceflight so far, so we get that perspective of kind of where we've been, where we are now, and then where we're going, and why it's going to be so much more challenging than what we've ever done before. So this is an oversimplified plot of kind of the history of human spaceflight, where we really started with the Mercury program, in parallel the Soviet space program, where the goals were really to get people into space, show that we could do it, and bring them back alive. And that evolved into the Gemini program that from NASA was really a proving ground for technologies that could be used to take us to the moon. So that was really the precursor to the Apollo era. Apollo, probably all of you know, took us to the moon. And then after that, we entered the shuttle ISS phase that was much more scientific development, and I'll dig a little bit more into each of these as we go. But then in the future, we're really headed back to the moon and eventually to Mars, and now we have commercial players that are a really important part of that process, and expanding international efforts that are going to make future missions potentially really incredibly large team efforts, which will be challenging, but also hopefully really fruitful. But as we've gone from the very beginning of human spaceflight to now, everything has increased in complexity. It's no longer one person in one capsule. Now we have, up to 12 people on the International Space Station at a time. The level of stressors for the crew has increased as well. As you leave low Earth orbit, you leave the protective radiation environment, so just that becomes a great stressor as you go to the Moon and Mars. And we've also set higher and higher expectations of our crews, and you can see that if you look at the qualifications of the folks that get selected to be astronauts. Every year, you can see the diversity of their skill sets has increased exponentially. So you have folks who are medics, ex-military, and PhDs, and doctors. Like, it's incredible, their skill sets, and that's because we have such high expectations for what they're gonna be able to do when they finally get their feet on the Moon or Mars. So starting kind of with how it all started, on the left is a model of Yuri Gagarin and his capsule. So we had these really fairly simple systems that were designed to take one human into low Earth orbit and bring them back to show that we could, in fact, do that. And we were doing something similar in the US with the Mercury program, where we had, and this was in the early 60s, and then that evolved into the Gemini program that I mentioned, where we were showing that we could do things like an extravehicular activity, that's Ed White in that photo, and then have multiple people in a capsule. This is what the capsule eventually that went to the Moon looked like. So moving forward from just test pilots and keeping them alive and bringing them back home to actual technology implementation to show that we were prepared to go to the Moon. From there, I'm sure you're all familiar with these images, but we did manage to get people on the Moon no matter what people might say. They did walk on the Moon. Here's a photo of the astronauts, and you can see here it's very homogeneous, right? Everyone has the same clothing, haircut, skin color, sex, everything's the same. So that's one thing that increases complexity now, is that now we have a much more diverse astronaut pool. So any methods that we use to monitor health have to be conscious of the fact that we no longer have kind of cookie cutter bodies that we're working with. We might have much more different physiological signals, and we need data to understand that variability if you're going to provide the support required to keep those people alive. So really, up until this point, we were focused on this idea of the right stuff, picking the people that fit the mold to then be able to withstand the stressors of the space environment. From there, we really started changing the types of people that we sent into space and what we were doing in space. So with the space shuttle coming online, and the shuttle ran from 1981 to 2011. So this is the program that I saw when I was a kid, and that got me excited about space exploration. And with the shuttle, we were able to bring big pieces of technology into space, telescopes like the Hubble Space Telescope that has made so much astronomy possible. And we began to send scientists and engineers beyond just the test pilot population. So we started to diversify the skill sets. We also started to increase our expectations of those crews. And that resulted in the building of the International Space Station, which you can see on the right. From there, this is kind of how it's going. For the last couple decades, we've been using the International Space Station as a platform for incredible research. And so you can see the different components of the International Space Station here that were built bit by bit during the shuttle program. But now there are 5 different space agencies that collaborate for the ISS, including NASA, Roscosmos, still, despite the geopolitical climate, Roscosmos is still a collaborator. ESA, the European Space Agency, JAXA, the Japanese Space Agency, and then CSA, the Canadian Space Agency. And those 5 agencies represent 15 different countries. So it's a huge multinational collaborative effort. And it's a really big facility. We have 6 sleeping quarters, 2 bathrooms, a gym, beautiful views of the Earth. It's pretty luxurious from human spaceflight, human space exploration standards. And with that, it also has really easy access to Earth's resources. There's Wi-Fi, there's basically real-time video with family if you're on the International Space Station. You get real-time interaction with the public. You've maybe tuned into astronauts speaking to schools and things like that. There's very easy communication. And getting back to Earth takes maybe 4 hours if you really needed to in an emergency. So really close to the infrastructure of Earth. There's a very good bailout option if it's needed. And then with that, there's also access to a full laboratory on orbit that's hosted over 3,000 experiments. And a lot of incredible science has been done on the ISS. A couple examples, drugs have been developed that can't be developed in Earth's gravity environment because of the structures. I am no chemist, but the structures are only possible in microgravity, so that's been used to develop new drugs to fight diseases. There's also been a ton of research on the physiological changes that occur to the human body in microgravity so that we can solve some of those issues before we send people much further away from Earth. And there's also been a lot of support of satellites, including Earth-observing satellites. So a lot of the Earth science and weather monitoring that's done has been enabled by the International Space Station and the humans on board. Actually, the astronauts also help monitor storms like hurricanes because they can see the Earth from different angles. So they'll often send photos to NOAA to help support the monitoring of those storms. So yeah, ISS has been amazing, has resulted in a lot of incredible research, but now we're nearing the end of its lifetime. You've maybe heard that the ISS is expected to retire sometime before 2030. That date keeps shifting a little bit, but basically it's become too expensive to maintain and still be able to allocate funds to future exploration missions and the next things that NASA wants to see happen. So there's going to be a bit of a hole in low Earth orbit, which will likely be filled by commercial entities. So a couple examples here. Blue Origin has been planning this orbital reef facility that they've called a multi-use office park. The idea is that different companies could rent out a module and run experiments in that module. And they would have, different players coming up and down depending on what their needs were. Similar on the right, this company VAST has designed this Haven 1 space station that would be similar. This would be a first module, and then they would add modules as need grows. And you can see the dates here. This is nominally going to be operational in 2027, which crazily enough is not that far away. And then VAST is supposed to launch in May of 2026, which is also really soon. But just this shift in commercial players kind of taking over research in low Earth orbit means that we'll have different types of people in space. It will no longer just be astronauts selected by the government-based selection programs. There will be, maybe people like maintenance folks up on the space station who don't necessarily have a science or engineering background, and the type of support they will need will be different than what the folks that we've had experience with might need. So really changing the landscape of what low Earth orbit is going to look like. In addition to increasing commercial players, we're also looking at broadening international capabilities. So on the left are some photos of the Indian Space Agency doing a test flight of their capsule. So they're following a very similar trajectory to the NASA Mercury, Gemini, Apollo trajectory, where they're starting with test pilots in the Indian Air Force and trying to grow their program from there. But they will, I think they have plans to get humans up into low Earth orbit by 2027 as well. And then on the right, you can see the Tiangong space station, excuse my pronunciation, but that's China's orbiting laboratory, which has also been running experiments since 2021. And they've also just recently tested a lunar lander, and they plan to go to the moon pretty soon in the next, I think before 2030 is the current estimate. So really interesting that we have, more international presence in human spaceflight than ever before. And there are no general standards for human spaceflight, right? Like each country selects their own crews, has their own expectations of those crews. So the world doesn't really have shared expectations or a shared mental model of what human spaceflight should look like. So this will be really interesting in the next decade to see what happens. On home soil here, NASA's planning missions to the moon, to return to the moon, the Artemis missions. This is the Orion capsule that will take 4 astronauts to lunar orbit, launching in April 2026 is the plan for a 10-day mission to go around the moon and come back to Earth. And then Artemis 3 is planned to actually land at the lunar South Pole in mid-2027. So those missions are theoretically coming up really soon. And then Artemis 4, the next in that series, will actually leverage a lunar space station, the Gateway station, and then descend from there to surface operations. So increasing complexity. You can see here a mission concept of operations for the Artemis 4 mission that's utilizing this lunar space station. And you can see here just how many transitions there are. You have the crew coming from Earth, docking with the space station, and then making trips down to the surface from that station. And just Gateway itself consists of modules from 3 different providers. I think 2 of those are commercial, and 1 is ESA, which is the European Space Agency. So really interesting integration between different systems and much more heterogeneity than we've seen before in space operations for humans. So when we think about the particular challenges for human spaceflight of future missions to the moon, the image on the right is of the possible landing sites for Artemis 3, which are all really unknown to us. All the information we have comes from the Lunar Reconnaissance Orbiter that's been taking photos of the moon for quite a while. But there are permanently shaded regions that are suspected to potentially contain water, and that's why we're so interested in this region. It's also really challenging terrain, so there are really big craters. There are canyons similar to the size of the Grand Canyon, maybe bigger than the Grand Canyon. And so when we think about landing on a surface like this, it's going to be very different than the landings that were done for the Apollo missions that were in this much smoother, much more observable region of the moon. This will take a lot of potentially pilot control of the landing process, just given the localized terrain challenges that might be encountered. There's also a lot of complexity here, as I mentioned, so there are a lot of transitions between the microgravity environment to the lunar gravity environment that can be challenging for your sense of balance, for your muscles and bones, your body movement, that kind of thing. And there's also very limited infrastructure and resources on the surface of the moon, especially in the South Pole. One key challenge is that communications will be delayed, and the physics-based delay from Earth to the moon is between 3 and 15 seconds, which you might think is not that impactful, but most of our operations right now run with real-time communication with the ground. So if you listen in to a spacewalk that's happening on the International Space Station, you can hear every single item that is completed is read back to ground control, and ground control confirms receipt and then potentially asks for another piece of information. And that includes reporting vital signs during the spacewalk. Everything is happening in real time. And so that's the cadence of communication that we've become really accustomed to. And if you've ever been on a Zoom call that has like a 3-second lag, it's incredibly detrimental to understanding what people are talking about. So this will be very, very challenging. And just like on Earth, if you go into a canyon and you're using your habitat as a relay for communications, your communications will suffer. So that seconds level communication delay might increase even beyond that if you're the spacewalk crew exploring the depths of a crater. So when we think about how this trickles down to impacts on the crew, with this complex terrain, and I also forgot to mention that the planned EVAs are for like 6 to 8 hour EVAs, where what we do now is much shorter than that. And they're also planned for multiple days each week, because the goal is to do science on the surface and collect geological samples. So it's a very high cadence, which can lead to repetitive stress injuries. The spacesuit is really challenging to move around in. That can create rotator cuff issues. You can get fingernail delamination, so your fingernails can fall off just by squeezing the gloves and rubbing against the gloves. The communication delays, as I mentioned, can lead to inefficiencies, frustration, which if you're frustrated every day for 8 hours, that might lead to chronic stress. And you're also really separated from behavioral health support. Right now on the International Space Station, crew have real-time access to psychiatrists who they check in with fairly regularly, and those are protected communications. We're not sure what that structure is going to look like for future exploration missions, which is a pretty big game changer when you think about mental health and high-performing individuals in these environments. We also have, as I mentioned before, the transitions between the gravity environments can lead to disorientation, which if you have a pilot who needs to be super aware of their position, looking at craters on the surface, getting to the surface of the moon, that could be a big challenge. And then limited access to abort and resupply. So as I mentioned before, for ISS, you can get back to Earth's surface pretty quickly if you need to. That's obviously not the case with the moon, which we saw in Apollo 13. If you're familiar with that case, there's a pretty big problem, and it was pretty questionable whether they were going to be able to get back to Earth or not. So the moon is one thing. Mars is a whole other animal that we aren't really sure how to tackle yet. As I'm sure all of you know, Mars is much further away than the moon. And so the mission duration would be even longer. So we're talking about a 200-day transit, which we don't actually have a vehicle that will be able to do that yet. About a 500-day surface stay is what this design reference mission, this was updated maybe 4 or 5 years ago. That's saying a kind of a 500-day stay on Mars. And then there's also the return journey, which psychologically is maybe the riskiest part, where you've done all the things you were supposed to do, and now you're sitting on your spacecraft for 200 days in microgravity, just coming back to Earth. That would drive most people up the wall. With Mars, there's even more uncertainty. There's much more that we don't know about the surface, about the radiation environment, about the physiological effects of a higher gravity environment and doing similar levels of extravehicular activity. There are tons of challenges there that we don't even know what we don't know at this point. And there's even less infrastructure, including longer communication delays. So for Mars, we're talking minutes level, so maybe 5 to 22 minutes-ish in communication delays. So the way that we do operations really will have to change. We won't be able to have our crews rely on mission control. And this is all leading me to this point that really we need our crew to be self-sufficient. And everything that we do in research should be pointing toward this idea of self-sufficiency, so that we have crews that can help themselves when things go wrong. They don't necessarily need that real-time communication with the ground. So things like managing anomalies. If there's an error in the water processing system, we need these crews to be able to manage those anomalies in real time with a lot lighter support from mission control. So also having all the information about all their systems at their fingertips in the spacecraft instead of relying on experts on the ground. And then being able to maintain health without continuous intervention from the ground. Ground does a lot of health monitoring of astronauts on the ISS. A lot of that now will need to be astronauts monitoring their own health, or perhaps the mission leader monitoring the rest of the crew. And then handling emergent situations. So if there is a fall during an EVA and there's a broken bone or a contusion or something, how is that going to be handled without additional resources from the ground, without being able to call a physician or a surgeon in real time? And then really thinking about designing for reusability instead of disposability. Our approach to use of materials in low Earth orbit has been take up as many as you need and then throw them away, let them burn up in the atmosphere. This goes for everything from like washcloths to t-shirts to socks, to other materials that the crew uses. And we really aren't going to be able to do that for future long duration missions, where if you're sending a crew, this is our Artemis 3 crew that'll land on the surface of the moon, we can't really afford to send hundreds of t-shirts because the launch mass of that is really high, it gets really expensive. So this is really what all of the research my group is working on is focused on, this idea of developing crews that are self-sufficient and giving them the resources they need to manage their own health and performance in these long-duration missions. So the first step towards self-sufficiency is really providing the crew with the data that they need in order to monitor their own status instead of running all this information through ground. And so a lot of what we work on is unobtrusive health monitoring. And so this is an example of a wearable electrocardiogram, or the electrical activity of the heart. That's what this system detects with textile electrodes that have conductive threads woven into them. And so we've been testing different designs to see how usable they are, how comfortable they are, especially on different body types. Most wearable systems are kind of designed for your standard male body. And if you're measuring something that's measured across the chest, like electrocardiogram, obviously different body types have different levels of movement across the chest, which are really important to account for. So that's been the focus of this work that one of my PhD students, Sarah, is doing for her PhD. And she's actually been weaving the electrodes herself on a big automated loom so that you're actually integrating the conductive fibers into the fabric itself, making these electrodes have the look and feel of clothing, which makes them a lot more accessible and potentially usable for the crew long term. Another big benefit is that if you've ever had to have like a Holter monitor for a heart assessment, you have to wear the adhesive electrodes on it for like 30 days. They can get really uncomfortable, and they also are single use, right? You use those electrodes and then you throw them away and they can't be used again. So if we wanted ECG to be measured every single day by every crew member, we would need to send thousands of electrodes in order to do that. And the benefit of these textile electrodes is that they can actually be laundered and reused. We're actually working with a company that's developing a non-water-based, non-chemical-based laundering system for spaceflight, and we're testing our electrodes with that system as well. So really thinking about this idea of reusability instead of disposability is really important. And once we are able to develop these unobtrusive measurement methods, we can potentially collect a lot of different passive signals from the human. So this is just a sketch of all the different pieces that you can collect from the human body to better understand state. So ECG is on there to get your heart rate variability and heart rate. You can also collect respiration, blood volume pulse, electrodermal activity, which is a measure of sweat. And you can also use functional near-infrared spectroscopy, which is basically shining a light into your brain and seeing how many oxygenated hemoglobin reflect back the light. So you can see which parts of your brain are getting oxygen at different times, which is a good indicator of which parts of your brain are being used. You can also use non-contact measures like optical facial motion capture you can learn a lot from someone's facial expression in terms of their state, level of stress, depression, anxiety, that kind of thing. And then using actually vocal signals as well, not just what people are saying, but also the frequency, content, and dynamics of their voice to understand their state. When we think about psychological and behavioral health, one thing that makes crews more self-sufficient is if you give them the resources to actually change their environment to better suit their needs. And this is what one of my other students is working on, Mish Lin, who is one of my MIT students who will graduate soon. But they actually developed a habitat that was deployed in an extreme operational environment. So this was in Scotland in the winter, which was quite cold, I think. And the idea was to use this environment as a way or these panels within this environment to modulate sound, because sound can be a very startling stimulus. It can help us modulate our behavioral state, our interaction with the environment. And so the idea here was to use locally sourced wool from farms in Scotland to help modulate the level of sound entering that environment. So just an example of how habitat design can play into crew health and performance, and how making these environments adaptable and adaptive can go a long way in terms of supporting the crew. From there, I mentioned before that teaming is a really important part of human space exploration. Nothing we do is possible without teams in space exploration, and that includes non-human team members. So a lot of our work is looking at how a human can work with a robotic system, and how we can measure the state of the human and see if they're able to still work in the creative, risk-taking way that humans do if they have a robotic partner instead of a human partner. And so this is something one of my students, Jasmine, has been working on, where we have this robotic arm and have had people interacting with it to complete different tasks. And we want to measure things like trust in that system, situation awareness, so does the human know what the robot is doing and what it's capable of, and then psychological safety, which is the feeling of being able to take a risk without retribution in a team, which is, there's a lot of literature on that from corporate workplaces, but it's super important if you have, an astronaut building a new habitat on the lunar surface with a robotic partner. We need to make sure that that human is safe to be the creative, risk-taking, bold human, even though they have just this robotic partner instead of an additional human partner. And this is something we're trying to advance to get those robotic partners to really be human-like in their behavior. So this is what my postdoc Ulu is working on, is enabling the robotic system to be taught by the human in real time. So we're using something called kinesthetic teaching, where the human can manipulate the robot to inspect this pipe, pretend that's a pipe, and actually physically move the robot, and then the robot will learn from that movement and repeat it. And we're also using computer vision so that the robot basically can see as a human partner would, and then large language models to enable the human to just give natural language voice commands. So say, I want you to look at that red section, instead of having to parse that speech into specific robotic-like commands. So really trying to make this system more human-like and a more collaborative, autonomous teammate for such a challenging environment. We also think about, sorry, this never works how I want it to. Come back, mouse. There it is. We also think about human autonomy teaming outside of the laboratory environment, because it's one thing to understand how these systems function in the lab, but it's a completely different animal to see them working in an operational environment. So in our department, we actually teach a course where we take a group of 20 students out to Mars Analog in Utah, Hanksville, Utah. I don't know if you've ever been there, great place. We take them out there for a week, and we have them do simulated spacewalks, and they also encounter medical emergencies and have to figure out how to handle those medical emergencies. And the project that I developed for this course was to have this robotic partner, which you can see is a quadruped robot, so a dog-like robot that we named Reggie. And they had to basically develop a payload for Reggie, put medical supplies in Reggie, and then figure out how to use this robotic system as a fifth teammate, especially if one of their teammates became injured. What's the right way to deploy this system? Can it work in the terrain? And we had a lot of Reggie flipping over up these steps in the dust. So we learned a lot about performance of these systems in a Mars-like environment. In general, I've talked a lot about autonomy, and I'm sure you're all aware that AI has advanced incredibly in the last few years, and that's something we should really take advantage of. So in thinking about the problem-solving process, going from the source of a problem to the resolution of that problem, there is potentially time due to communication delays that can be spent with each end of the communication trying to problem solve on their own, and that can be really augmented by the presence of AI. So you could have your astronaut on the moon interacting with a chatbot that's helping them problem solve, and someone on Earth doing the same thing, and then potentially arriving at a solution faster than they would otherwise. And my group has also looked at integrating AI into behavioral health support. When you lose this ability for real-time communication with a psychiatrist, can you replace some of those positive benefits by having someone do a journaling task with an LLM-driven chatbot? Does that have the same positive psychological effects? And this was my student, Golda, who actually just graduated with her PhD and is looking for work, by the way. So reach out if you work in the human-computer interaction space. But that's what we've been investigating is whether having this AI capability integrated to a journaling tool could be helpful for behavioral health support. Results of the study were that jury's still kind of out, not really sure what the long-term effects of something like this would be. And of course, there's a lot of risk there with getting people addicted to that kind of AI-driven chat support. So a really interesting area to be working in. Alongside all of these research efforts, we do a lot of research in space analog environments, including analogs built specifically for the study of human spaceflight. So that's what you can see on the right is NASA's Human Exploration Research Analog at Johnson Space Center has been used for many studies of crews of 4 for 30-day missions, which is a great proving ground for new technologies. Unfortunately, the upcoming missions for Hera have been canceled, which is really sad. And High Seas is a similar facility in Hawaii that was also discontinued recently. But then there's the Mars Desert Research Station, which is where we run that class that I mentioned. And then there are many natural space analogs. So McMurdo Station in Antarctica. There are many Arctic stations as well, where you have people living for extended durations in isolation and confinement in these extreme environments. And we take advantage of those analog environments to better understand what behavioral health and performance might look like long term. Because obviously we can't send people to Mars first to try out these things before we send the real crew. One of those environments is submarines. So I was lucky enough to have a master's student, Kai, who is a former submariner, who's actually now in med school after getting his master's in engineering, which is just insane. He's great, and he ran a survey-based study of submariners and managed to get about 500 responses to better understand what is impactful in that isolated, confined environment when it comes to maintaining your psychological health. And we're still analyzing that data because it's such a big, comprehensive data set. So I'll close here with this image of a 17th century sailing vessel, because this is really what the future of human space exploration looks like. We're no longer going to be nestled in the Earth's magnetic field, protected close to infrastructure. We're really sending folks far away from the resources on Earth with very little ability to support them in real time. So we're entering a really new era of human space exploration where we need our crews to be self-sufficient. And this idea of self-sufficiency can also help the general population, where we have many rural communities that don't have good access to things like healthcare or education. And so we can use a lot of these concepts that we're developing for creating more self-sufficient crews here on Earth to help many of our more isolated communities. So I'll close there, and I'm happy to answer questions, and I'll just throw up my contact information and then links to our bioastronautics program website and then our aerospace program here. But thank you very much.
I do have a question.
Yeah.
Right. Are you ready for questions?
I'm ready, yep.
Okay. So I read this article on National Geographic recently on commercial exploration, right? And commercial exploitation. So with AI, robotics, coming into play, and the commercial guys probably jumping on that. Human spaceflight to Mars or Moon may be relegated to the Hollywood. I mean, I'm sorry.
Maybe.
So what is the cost benefit here? I mean, where do you see that going?
Yes, I will say that the science that we've been able to do with rovers on Mars pales in comparison to what we could do with 2 humans in 2 weeks, with a robotic partner potentially. But the gains from having a human that's adaptable to a dynamic environment on that new environment for science are huge. I'm not sure if that answers your question, but.
It does in a way, but how would you expect, say, a government to invest in a manned?
Yeah, well, I can no longer predict how governments invest. But yes, I see what you're saying. I think human exploration of the moon and Mars is really it's an effort for humanity, not for commercial gain and not for military gain. And I think we need to lean into that if it's going to be successful. I'm not sure if that's what's going to happen, but I think it needs to come from a place of supporting scientific exploration to better understand our place in the solar system, and that should be a priority in my mind. That's a good question. Yeah.
Okay, and I know this feels like I'm asking the same question, but there's been a lot of talk that we develop better and better tools and that we end up with sort of a relationship with a few humans and a whole bunch of tools that are helping them as they go out. And how do you foresee the psychology behind that, or any sort of spot of like, in popular media there was a movie Moon about this. So you've only got like 1 or 2 humans and a whole bunch of things going on.
Yes, yeah.
But boy, it's a lot easier if the person trying to navigate around your crater to take a look at something has a disposable method to do so and a communication delay of less than a second.
Yeah. I love that you mentioned Moon. That's my favorite space movie ever. Yeah, I think in some ways that's the reality that we're seeing on Earth right now, where you have a single human supported by many, many technologies all the time, and we don't really know what the psychological impacts are. I mean, at first flush, it looks like that's potentially highly negative, especially for young people who become addicted to technology in some ways. I think, yes, that is what will happen if we're going to be successful in these environments, and we'll need to continue monitoring as we're doing here on Earth. But I think it's sort of the reality is that these technologies augment our capabilities, and so we have to take advantage of them if we're going to be successful in funding a mission to Mars. We need to make sure that it returns as much as possible in terms of scientific knowledge. Yeah.
So, well, this is probably going to sound like a really dumb question because I know nothing about radio communication.
All good.
I was just wondering how radio communication works from NASA on Earth to the astronauts in space. Because on Earth, it's either a cord, Wi-Fi, or cell phone towers. I've just always wondered, how the heck does that work in space?
Yeah, so I am no expert in space communications, but it's usually light-based communication, and that's why the delays are driven by the speed of light, not by the speed of sound. And I will leave it there so that I don't get too far out of my depth.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, a lot of interesting activities going on. Are these NASA directed, or a lot of these yourself? How is this tied into the
Yeah.
bigger architecture?
Yeah, so I did have a pretty sizable NASA grant to study the effects of communication delays on lunar surface operations, and that was unfortunately canceled a couple weeks ago. So that's where we're at right now. The military is also quite interested in similar technologies, so myself and a lot of my colleagues are pivoting to more military applications, unfortunately.
But even the studies with the making the devices mesh into.
Yes, yeah. So that student is partially funded by a private research laboratory, Draper Labs in Boston. So that's where some of that work is driven. Yeah.
Yeah, the International Space Station is a pretty good size, and I can see people living there for 200 days. But a trip to Mars would be another 200 days back, what size and what type of vehicle do they have in mind, and what kind of amenities would it have?
Yeah, that is
Certainly
still,
would be the size of the space station.
certainly would not be the same size.
But it has to perform the same function.
Yes, exactly. Therein lies the rub. It would be a much smaller vehicle because anything larger would be much more expensive to send. We wouldn't have the fuel to make that trip. The design of that vehicle is still very much to be determined. That hasn't been selected yet, but it would be a much smaller capsule. For example, the ISS has a full gym with a treadmill and a squat rack, and some of the ideas for exercise for those longer duration missions is like a rowing machine only. So just that kind of size reduction, we're talking about maybe half the space, maybe less. Yeah.
What technologies do you see being developed to protect humans against long-duration exposure to light radiation, solar radiation? 'Cause that's a big deal.
Yeah, it is a big deal. I actually have a student working on active magnetic shielding, so using magnetic fields to redirect particle paths. The challenge there is you need a ton of power to be able to do that, but there have been advances in superconductors recently that make that almost possible. So he's actually analyzing what you would need to do to be able to develop a magnetic shield and maybe use a hybrid system that has passive shielding, so just thick materials plus a magnetic field, and if that's enough to guard against that. But then the plan so far has been to kind of build bunkers where if you know a storm is incoming, you can have your crew go into a few well-shielded bunkers that you can't necessarily afford to have that level of material on the whole spacecraft, but you can put it in a few places. But it's still a huge problem. Yeah.
So let's say imagining a trip to Mars. So that's 500 days on, 400 days going and coming, and 500 days on Mars. So that's 900 days in low gravity conditions. But Mars is like, what, 40% of Earth?
Yeah, it's like 3/8, yeah.
So that's low. Does anybody really have a sense as to whether or not people are going to be able to survive that long trip and actually make the re-entry?
Yeah, short answer is no, we don't know. Slightly longer answer is we've had folks living on the International Space Station for a year, and so we can look at the data from their bones and their muscles, but we still don't necessarily know what the plateau is, or if there's a plateau, or if you just keep losing mass, and how we can compensate. If we're limited to a rowing machine, can we really compensate the same way we do with the International Space Station, especially if the expectations are for work 10 hours a day? Can you really take 2 hours to do exercise that whole mission?
Is anyone seriously considering the possibility of using centrifuges, maybe only during the sleeping hours?
Yes, that is something that is still being researched. And actually VAST, one of the companies I mentioned, part of their plan is to include artificial gravity on at least one of their modules on their space station. So it's something folks are still looking at. There are a lot of other actually, one of my colleagues is really focused on the development of artificial gravity, and the challenge with a short arm centrifuge is that you get illusions in the vestibular system. So if you move your head out of plane, you get this like tumbling sensation. So it's really hard to have a functional short arm centrifuge.
That's what I was thinking you would apply to the sleeping situation, where you just turn your head left to right, and the axis of
Yeah.
rotation is parallel to your body.
Yeah, potentially, yeah.
That way you can sort of sleep and you wouldn't have that problem.
Yeah, there are folks looking at the different operational paradigms that might work for artificial gravity, but the systems are still quite expensive and challenging to build. Good question, though. Yeah.
Is the 200-day and 500-day architecture set in stone?
No.
Or to follow the stone, do you provide any input to perhaps tell someone, hey, we increase the build on the technology to get us there faster to reduce the time instead of 2.5 years, maybe to 1.5 years?
Yeah.
Because that way you reduce a lot of the risks.
Yeah.
Maybe come.
Yeah, I would say that's one of the biggest goals right now, is to just reduce the transit time and potentially reduce the surface stay time. That's by no means set in stone. That's sort of a rough a rough idea of what that mission might look like. There are folks working on nuclear propulsion systems, other ways of providing propulsion, just really big propulsion systems as well.
Yeah, Dr. Franklin Chang Diaz has fastener technology.
Yeah, that's the electric propulsion.
Nuclear electric propulsion.
Yeah.
Thing. I mean, somebody knows different, but he says if you scale it up, and I've talked to him several times, he said you can scale it up. It works in the lab, and I don't see any issues. You just need the money.
Yeah,
Nobody's
exactly.
paying us any money.
Exactly. You just have to have the investment.
And he said he can get to Mars in weeks in a decent-sized spacecraft.
That'd be great. Yeah, I think that would solve many of our problems. But yeah, you would need a lot of fuel.
Very heavy.
Yeah. Yeah.
A couple questions from our online stream. One question about that robotic arm, and you mentioned large language models. This person says maybe we can add ChatGPT to the robotic arm. So maybe you could elaborate on what exactly the AI is doing there.
Yeah.
And the second question, has NASA considered adding pets to spacefaring party for emotional support?
I'll answer the second one first. I'm not sure if NASA has looked at that, but it is well known that pets provide emotional support and behavioral health support. I've read, I think, a couple papers on like robotic pets and their effects, especially like for the elderly. This is something that's very well known, that there's a Paro, like seal-shaped robot that's used a lot for elderly folks and works pretty well to provide some support. So I think it's not a bad idea. To the first, what was the first one? Oh, the large language models for the robotic arm and ChatGPT. Yeah, so my postdoc, Ulu, is actually using ChatGPT as the large language model that he is using to interact with the robot. So basically what he's doing is he has an algorithm that takes spoken words, transcribes them, feeds them to an instantiation of ChatGPT that has been trained to be a kind of robotic assistant on a specific task, and then taking the output and feeding it back through that text. It's read to text to read, text to speech, and so then the system speaks back to the user and performs some action with the robot. So very much trying to simulate this, like having two people standing next to each other working on the same task, having that same behavior from the robotic system. Yeah.
Just, I was a little confused about the communications delay
Mm-hmm.
on the pole side, South Pole, versus the light side of the moon, because that light side of the moon is pretty much relatively in a few seconds, right?
Yeah.
What makes the South Pole more challenging? Is it because of the canyons that need a relay? And
Yes.
then onto the
Yeah, so the idea for the future, for Artemis missions, is to have 6-ish communication satellites around the moon in a highly elliptical orbit that pass close to the South Pole and then have, pass further away on the other end of the moon. And so you'd need to potentially wait till one of those satellites is in range. And if you're at the bottom of a canyon, the cone is like smaller.
Okay.
You know what I mean?
That makes sense. Okay.
Yeah.
All right. That makes it clear. Thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah, I work for a company here in San Jose that makes image sensors, and some of our customers send them into space. I am an engineer, but I never took any engineering classes where I went, where they offered classes in radiation effects on electronics. So this is not something I know anything about my education. Is anything like that available at your school, or do you know any other academic resources where they teach classes in that topic? Or how do you learn about that?
We do, yeah. So we have a class on the aerospace environment that includes a discussion of the radiation environment, and we do touch on the impact on electronics, but I'm not sure that there's a whole class devoted to the interaction between electronics and radiation. But yeah, we do have, some of our curriculum touches on that. Good question.
What is the future for your research? I mean,
Dangerous question.
I just want to get an idea because it's kind of depressing.
Yeah, no, I think the future is bright for my research. We are really focused on how humans perform and maintain their performance in complex environments, and that's space, but it's also a lot of other environments, and there's amazing science done on Earth in really challenging environments as well, like on the poles and below the ocean surface. So there are plenty of people that we can analyze and try to augment their performance to improve the way we do science. Yeah, I think there are plenty of problems with human-system interaction as well, like humans and autonomous vehicles. Humans are now on factory floors working with robotic systems almost constantly, and that's a big area of research as well. So there's lots to do.
Let's see if there's no more questions. I'll thank our speaker.
Thanks for having me.